Welcome to another episode of Fair Folk at Work. My guest today is Douglas Michael Berger. And before we explain that enigmatic introduction, I'd like to start you with the traditional first Fair Folk at Work question, which is, who was the first person to say to you, there's this thing called fair, and what did they say to get you out there?
The first person to tell me about the fair was actually my high school sweetheart, now my wife. And that's because her madrigal group was going to go and sing there. The person who told me we're going to go to the fair and do this thing was my folk dance master, Richard Chase. And I must also give credit to Donna Hollander, who's now a Boothie, who I met at one of Richard's social dances, and also to Patty Blanco, who dragged me to Richard Chase's social dances. She said, there's this folk dance thing, and I think it's a lot of fun, and I think you'd like to do it. And I was like, folk dance? And she said, well, there's a lot of girls. And I said, okay, I'll be there. Sure enough, went there, met Donna, started going to the dances, and then they were all about, we're going to get costumed and we're going to go dance at the Renaissance Fair. So I was like, okay. Got my mom to help me make a costume, which included a purple shirt, of course. And away I went to the Renaissance Fair.
What was the name of your wife's madrigal group? And I guess, what is the name of your wife?
Sally Berger, Sally Irene Berger, Burdenberger. Sally's madrigal group. What was the name of your madrigal group, sweetheart? What was the name of the madrigal group you sang with that went to the fair?
Oh, it was just, I don't think we actually had a name. It was the Madrigal Singers, something like that. Madrigal Singers.
Was it like your high school friends or your church friends, or?
It was in school at Chaffee High School, where Doug and I both went. My dad was a Marine and was totally scandalized because he was walking through the fair, which I was just having. I was so happy. I loved it. All he could smell was the pot. And he was like, oh, this isn't where I want my daughter to end up. The rest is Doug's history. That was my last time at fair until we got back together. I don't know if you know our history, but we had an 18-year separation before we got back together. And Doug was out of the fair at that point, and I drugged his sorry ass back.
And Doug, your mirror remembrance of the experiences of the fair? The first fair you walked in is?
First fair I walked in, pretty much the same thing Sally mentioned, except that I was wholeheartedly participating in the herbal frequency.
Do you remember any specific acts or things on the street that you remember thinking, well, this is something I want to come back to?
Oh, no, what I was interested in, first of all, was to earn some food tickets and to take the dancing further. So to that end, I went to the entertainment folks and said, hi, I'm here with Richard Chase and we're dancing in the streets and stuff, but I'm looking for other things that I can do. And I ended up with a group of the guys from Richard Chase's dancers that we ended up carrying the Queen's chair. And in fact, it's a color glossy program, and I'm the left front tire, and it's Julie Meredith as the Queen. But that, looking at the dance and how it fit in the streets of the fair, I said, this could do much more than what it's doing, and it can be much more exciting, and we can do stage shows and things like that. We just have to figure it out. And that gets into a whole long thing of the evolution of the dance group. So we'll save that until you're ready for it.
What do you remember Richard Chase's dance philosophy or things he told you about period dancing?
Richard Chase did not have dance practices. He did play party games and play parties. And he was, besides the English folk dances and stuff that he knew, he also was into Appalachian folk dances and folk games and things like that. And also stories. He did storytelling. published Houghton Mifflin and Folkways Records, doing Grandfather Tales and the Jack Tales and Wicker John and the Devil.
Can I interrupt for a sec?
Sure.
Do you remember any of his play party games?
Oh, sure.
Can you describe one or two?
Well, my favorite was basically musical chairs, but it was called Squat. And basically, you would promenade the men clockwise, the women counterclockwise, the men on the inside, women on the outside. You did that until the music stopped. And it was always an uneven count. So you had to find an open partner and take them by the hands and squat down on the floor. In the squat, the last person who squats is eliminated. And then you go and do it again.
Did he say what was the reasoning behind playing squat at a erstwhile dance rehearsal?
It was obvious. It was how you meet everybody. It's how you have an opportunity to break the ice, as it were, to say hi. While you're squatting on the floor, it's like, well, hello, what's your name? And what's really hilarious is that I did a tour of England, and this goes further into the history of my work with the fair, but I was part of the group that went to England for the celebration of the Drake Quadricentennial. Morgan did that. She went as a lady in waiting. I portrayed Don Bernardino de Mendoza, the Spanish ambassador to Philly. Anyways, what I was going to say is during that visit, I spent some time with Peter. Peter's dad worked with Richard Chase in chronicling dances in England. And Peter's father was one of the founders of the English Folk Dance and Song Society. Anyway, Peter invited me to come out to Dartington Folk College, where they were having a dance that night. And then when we were there, I was invited to call some dances. And I did. And then Peter said, and Doug, I think you can have a special treat for us. Do us a play party game. And I played squat with all of these staid Englishmen. And it was frankly hilarious. But they were giggling and playing and got totally into the spirit of the thing. When I first told them what they were supposed to do, you go around and then when the music stops, find a partner and squat. And they're like, and what? And most of these people were quite well-to-do, staid English folks studying the folk traditions. And at Dartington, it was a lot of fun. So anyways, there are stacks of Appalachian folk play party games. Another one is cakewalk. People are familiar with the term cakewalk, but they didn't understand that in Appalachian times, that was a genuine cake walk. The girls would come with a cake, and then they would walk up and down in front of the group, showing off their cake and their cake and that sort of thing. And again, all about, you're from the next holler, but you don't get over there to see that girl very often. So that kind of dance, that kind of games was part of what Richard included in his play parties and the dancing that we were doing, which we were doing, by the way, at the Claremont colleges. Two facilities that we used. One was a park facility in Claremont, city of Claremont, and the other was the local Unitarian church.
It seems that with Richard and Morgan and the Patty Blanco, there was a much more emphasis on sort of having fun and being theatrical and entertaining to those who are both doing it and watching it. And at the same time, there was another folk dance tradition, which was much more slower or true to the 16th century court kind of tradition. Is that your impression as well, or?
No, it's fairly accurate. Richard Chase's things were play party games and play dances. And on the other hand, Richard had a dream of doing the Anglo folk ballet, which was to present a full-on program of the dances of Appalachia and England. So Richard Chase had this idea of doing a fancier version, but lively. But what Richard always told me was lilt. He said, you have to lilt in your movement. You have to be smooth and lilt in your movement. There was a group at the fair that was doing the court dancing. Names escape me so much these days. It's been years since I've done the fair. But there was a gal that led the court contingent at the fair, and they were doing gabiots and things like that, which were actually beautifully done. And she and I collaborated on a program that we did with Chanticleer, did a Christmas program where the Morris team performed and I played the Lord of Misrule. We had both the court dancing and the folk dancing. Stylistically, they're very different, but they can both be done with energy depending on what dance it is. When Richard Chase decided to retire, he had decided to retire. We didn't know it. We were at a play party game at the park facility in Claremont, and he called me up in front of everybody, and he told me to kneel. And I was like, what? And he said, kneel down. And he was a crafty old fart. You did not mess with the man. I'm like, crazy idiot. Sure, I'll kneel down. And he said, I have an announcement to make to the group. I'm retiring. I'm going back to Berea, Kentucky to do my memoirs. And then he pulled the ram and goblet necklace off his neck, put it around mine, and said, it's up to you, Doug. Don't let it die. That was after I'd done my first fair and dancing in the streets with him. So I only did one fair with Richard Chase, to my memory. He had been our source of music. We didn't have any musicians. He played harmonica, of all things, for our dancing in the streets at the fair. So we had a long ways to go, in my opinion, to do an Anglo folk ballet. But I always kept that in mind, and also a painting by Peter Bruegel of the peasant wedding and the ale yard. And if you look at those people, scarcely any of the dancers have a foot on the ground. And if you're a dancer, you know what that means. It means they're flying. It means that's a very high energy dance because they don't have a foot on the ground. They're flying. And that was my inspiration. But also, I didn't have any music. I got in touch with Peg Long, who was entertainment director. And I said, hi, I'm Doug Berger. I danced with Richard Chase. And she goes, I know who you are. And I said, well, did you hear that Richard's retiring? And she goes, I had heard that. And I said, well, do you still want us to dance? And she goes, oh, definitely. And I said, well, then I need some help. I don't have any music. And she goes, let me see what I can do. She called me back in a few days and she said, you're going to get a call one of these days real quick from this guy named Dave Ricker. And he thinks he can help you. And so I met Dave. He was a fiddle champion, a former Marine Corps drill sergeant, which meant he had perfect beat. His cadence was absolutely rock hard rigid, which for a dancer is a blessing. He said, I understand you were dancing with Uncle Dick. And I said, so you know Richard Chase? He says, oh, yeah. And I said, well, yeah, we need music. He goes, yeah, I know all the tunes. He goes, let me get back to you. And he goes, I'll call you in a week or so. And I called him and he said, come over to my place and meet your band. And I went over there and we had a band assembled. Dave Ricker on fiddle and band leader, Bob Thomas on English bagpipes and flute, Ernie Fishbach on pipe and tabor, and Ron Wilson, the drummer from the Safaris, on drum. So we went from a harmonica and then no music to having a shit-kicking band that was so much better than we were. I mean, that's the only way to put it. They just kicked ass. They all knew the music already. And I said, we got to start practicing with these guys, and we've got to get the dance up to the speed that they're on. So Pipe and Bowl and Newcastle's focus was very much performance.
This is a weird question, but do you remember sort of the first song that the band and the dancers gelled at?
Madge on a Cree.
And what made that song come together for everybody, if you can recall?
It has a very solid beat. It has a very structured chorus that's repeated 4 times through the course of the dance. So it's very grounding. It becomes comfortable. From the dancer's perspective, you should not have to think about the dance. It should be muscle memory. The music should tell you, and your body should know. And that's when a dance gels. And all the dancers have to be tuned in to that. And once you hit that point, then the dance just flies. It does itself, and it's just pure joy, and that plays to the audience.
When you look at when Phyllis et al. Started FAIR, and you look at what other historic preservation efforts were happening, there was a sharp dichotomy between, say, colonial Williamsburg and the fair, which was immersive, and that Phyllis was coming out of a theatrical tradition that meant everybody was there to play, and the purpose was to create a living environment. How did your philosophy of a dance ballet mesh with that vision?
Well, we didn't really want to be in the street very long. Once we got that band together, we were headed for the stage. But we still, in the course of the fair, for the entirety of the group's history, we continued to dance in the streets daily as well, because we felt like it needed to be out there. Part of that was, as Phyllis and as Peg Long both explained it to me rather well, is to say that the point was first person interpreted. It was history seen through the eyes of living it. And the only way you can do that is to gameplay. Just put yourself there and say, that's who I am. And that's what I'm doing. So the street dancing, the stage dancing was for the crowds. And we loved it. And we had a very hot show. We had a main stage audience one day that numbered, the security told me it was 4,000 to 5,000 at Southern Fair. I mean, I've got a picture of it. It's insane. But
the street dancing was for the people, individual. Was that where you're going?
Where I'm going is it was for the first person interpretive. That's where I'm going. If you actually were somebody living in the village of Chipping under Oakwood and it's festival, it's fair time, you don't have to go shuck bales of hay. You're going to go and dance in the inn yard with that pretty gal you've been eyeing. And that's what you're going to portray. So we encouraged in the dancing flirtation with not just with the dancers, but with the audience to bring them in.
Do you remember any specific bits that the dancers would do to draw in an audience?
That was really basically individuals. More often than not, it was a gal bringing in a guy or a guy bringing in a gal because they looked like they were having fun and needed to be part of it. When we were first starting out, we were clumsy at it, but we wanted to do street theater as much as possible. I was really blessed. We would do a processional dance into the fair to help open the fair every morning. And so I had to be out at the front gate. Every day it turned out I'd leave Don Brown's with a cup of coffee, headed to the front gate, and Will Wood was doing the same thing. People were just coming in, and I was walking along with Will Wood, and he would engage damn near everybody that we passed. I learned a ton from that man as far as street theater and as far as audience involvement and pulling them into the show, making them part of the show. I would say that from the dance group's perspective, it was showing the patrons, one, that they could be part of it, but two, that this is what, on a festival day in town, we're not going to be pounding out the iron or sawing the wood. We're frolicking in the inn yard.
One of the themes of this podcast is that what Phyllis and the people who preceded us or preceded me, they have made basic decisions that are still being done at Renaissance fairs around the country And they might never have heard of Phyllis Patterson or environmental theater. Just the basic premise of it's fair day, the queen is coming, we're here to buy and sell stuff and basically dance in the streets. It was just a fundamental decision that you can see at fairs that have never heard of Phyllis or never heard of Agora.
Yeah, I definitely think that the woman has an incredible legacy. I'll point out that I worked with the fair on many different levels. In addition to the dance groups, I did education programs, then I directed the education programs. I did development, then I was director of development. I ran activities, games, and occult for 2 fairs, which meant that I had my fortune told in every which way imaginable. In that role, I also met with dignitaries and ushered people around the fair, studio heads and people, potential donors. I've been honored, actually, just recently asked to join the board of advisors for LHC, and I've accepted. The Phyllis and the fair in California had way more influence than is imagined in what you were just saying about it, saying that they've never heard of Phyllis or never heard of the fairs out here. They were barking at that door 30 years ago, 40 years ago. As a matter of fact, recall, and Phyllis was very open in sharing about this because I discussed it with her. I said, I was out at the fair the other day. I saw a vehicle driving through. I went over to see what's up, and it's these people from Minnesota. They wanted to see your fairgrounds and they wanted to see what we were up to here because they'd heard about it and they're interested in doing something. And she goes, did you show them around? And I said, yeah. She goes, good. I think that the influence is more pervasive. In my travels over the years, anytime I mention it, somebody knows what I'm talking about, may be aware that the California Fair was the first, but do understand there's a movement and it's something, it's not just a party. I do think that while Phyllis certainly was, pretty much do what you do, she was very interested in keeping it within period. She was
Yes.
very interested in keeping anachronisms out. There's a story, I won't mention the fellow's name, but he was a juggler and he was somewhat profane. He was an exceptional street performer. Guy drew huge crowds, but Phyllis didn't like his shtick. And she didn't like that it was too anachronistic and asked me to work with the fellow. I worked with him for about 2 weeks and coached him through his routine and said, could you say this instead of that? Could you do this instead of that? With the goal of getting him back on the streets, which I was successful in doing. But Phyllis would still go and give him shit now and then. I think she's very definitely paid attention to being in period. And the entertainment directors more or less followed that march. I know that Peg was very strong in that area. All of them were strong on keeping it in period, which I think is part of the magic.
I think another aspect of the magic of the fair, also something that Phyllis helped set up, which was that the fair was a place where everybody was welcome and everybody could play on the same side of being in this Elizabethan village. To me, the fair was a place that you invited people to play with you. Am I again getting that wrong or right? Or
No, I think that's fair, but I think that if you go back a couple of ticks further to the actual very beginnings of the fair, Phyllis was trying to teach Renaissance history to her students. She was a teacher in the 5th or 6th grade, I can't recall which, when they study English Renaissance as part of the normal curricula. She latched onto this concept of first-person interpretive history. So to her, it was about getting the details right and then bringing them into that so that they could learn history and have fun while they do it. And I ran Workshop in the Woods for a couple, 3 years. And that's what it was all about. And that was Phyllis's baby. She loved that program. She always came out and observed every year. She'd get all costumed up and everything and come out to the workshop just to visit and watch things. Ricker and I did a country dance and folk play workshop at Workshop in the Woods for several years. Then I just handed it over to him. And the whole time it was about the learning. So I agree that she definitely had a strong desire to bring people in, but she did not want to lose track of the time travel. That's the best way to put it.
In those days, who was on the faculty at Workshop in the Woods?
Judy Corey did the Commedia. Judy was a teacher there. Kenny Milliken was a teacher there. Springhorn played the sheriff. Dave and I are dear friends. And we had Jay Paul as Lord Mayor, Will Woods as the schoolmaster. Peter Papermaker was a popular workshop. And we had a ceramics workshop. And we had the English country dance and folk play, where we do a mummers play along with teach them a couple of folk dances. And then we do a performance at the end of the day. And so would the Commedia. And
So was there anyone else at the Workshop in the Woods that you'd care to mention?
oh yeah, there was the folks that did sheep to coat. And that group would teach the kids how to shear sheep and card wool and spin yarn and weave. And it was a great workshop. And they dye their different yarns and things like that. Kids would go home with a little pot holder or something like that. It was a good workshop all in all for the Workshop in the Woods, and they were great people.
Now, did this go to individual schools or did they come to you? And where was the Workshop on the Woods?
The Workshop on the Woods was at the fair lot, middle of the week, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday. The fair lot was closed, like locked down from 7:30 in the morning until 4:30, 5 o'clock for the workshop. So no anachronisms. The quickest way for a boothie to get thrown out of the fair was to ignore the signs that say no vehicles on the lot, costumed only. The schools, we developed a relationship with them. I've got a certificate of appreciation from LA County Schools for the school programs that Ricker and I were doing. And we were going out, and when I ran the education programs, we did more. We had Judy going out, and we had Ricker and I going out, and we had Kenny Milliken going out and visiting individual schools and doing programs where we'd work with students for an hour or so, a select group of students, and then put on some kind of performance or something for the rest of the school. And part of that was to introduce them to Workshop in the Woods, which was something that they had to pay for, whereas the school programs were free. Ricker and I, over the years, probably did close to 1,000 school programs. I mean, we would go out over 100 of them a year.
What did you like about working with the people at the Workshop in the Woods?
It was a great pleasure of mine running the education programs because I worked with the best of the best. And they were all fabulous. I mean, every one of them was just fabulous. And although I had to tone down Kenny Milliken a few times, he would just start to go way over the deep end. And I'd go, Kenny, Earth to Kenny. Let's come back at least to the Renaissance Earth, okay?
So this happened at the fair site between the weekend performances. How were the workshops on the site?
The workshops, which were separated to their own areas. There was the schoolroom, there was the potter wheels, there was the paper making, there was an area set up for the folk dance and mummers plays. And the Commedia did their workshop on the main stage. And then there was a lunch break where everybody got together and ate lunch together, and we'd have some entertainment during lunch. Then at the end of the day, all the classes would gather at the main stage, and then the Commedia group would do their performance, and the folk dance and mummers play would do the mummers play and the folk dances that were intermingled in the play. And there was a speech from the Lord Mayor wishing them all well as they travel back to their villages and bring the secrets of the fair with you. Then they were ushered out. The students came onto the site on buses that unloaded down below by the parking area, and Bob Thomas would be standing up on that hill above the main entrance playing his bagpipes, welcoming them into the fair. So as they made the walk all the way into the fair site, they were accompanied by the bagpipe music. It was a magical, magical event.
So
And
I'm guessing like 300 students was the typical number or something like that, or?
somewhere around 300 to 500, yes, because they were divided into these separate groups. Back up a little bit. The way it worked is that we had developed a curricula. Dick Bagwell did a lot of the work on that, and I did a bunch of work on it. And we ended up with a lesson plan that we gave to the teachers that wanted to do it. And then they also had to do fundraisers and stuff to get the money to pay for their way. We had some scholarships available at the Living History Center, particularly inner city schools, but most of the schools paid. And you tended to get a lot of pilot schools and stuff like that, a lot of very forward thinking schools. They got a set of materials to work on, and it included their clothing, it included character development, like who are you in this period of time, costuming, what your clothing would look like if that's who you are, because everybody had to come in costume. Now, costumes, sometimes they would take a burlap bag, cut a hole in the top, stick it over the kid, there's a costume. Fine, he's a peasant. And then you did all of these things so that when the kids came, we actually had it set up along the walkway. There were signs with dates and pictures through history. You're walking through history until you got to the English Renaissance. There you'd be greeted by the Lord Mayor from up on the gate. Who approaches the Shire today? All of that kind of thing.
Did you mix kids up from different schools, or did they stay basically?
No, the classes stayed together because that's the way they prepared, and that was the group they were with. And their teacher had chosen which workshops they were going to go to. So there was a form the teachers had to fill out and send back. List your first, second, third, and fourth choices because they're finite, and we'd always fill everything. They stayed within their contiguous group. They did commingle during lunchtime and at the closing show, but pretty much they stayed within their group.
Did some schools come back year after year?
Absolutely. There was one teacher at Northern Fair, Sue English. She was a teacher at Rohnert Park Elementary. She came to Workshop in the Woods 2 years in a row. And the next year, she was a volunteer dancer in my group at the fair. She had come that year to do one of the classes she was signed up for was dance and mummers play. She went up to Ricker and said, "Can I do this at the fair?" And he goes, "Heck yeah, got to come to pre-fair workshops. Doug and I will be teaching." We had quite a few returns. We had a teacher from Westlake Village, Southern Fair, brought his class every year for the entire time I was there. It was what Phyllis wanted to do for school kids. I mean, that's the first fairs were in her backyard for her school class. That was the very first fairs. As far as the dance groups, Uncle Dick retired. Basically, there was a core group that had been dancing for a couple of years. I did 2 fairs with Richard Chase, 1 or 2, I can't recall. There was Richard Seville and Patty Blanco and Greg Dana and myself. Greg and Richard went off to do a mummers play. They decided they wanted to do mummers plays, not the dance. But not before Seville, who was an accomplished actor, helped the whole group with staging and developing the look of the stage and how it would be draped with bodies and who'd be hoisting a mug, and which was very helpful. Patty was working with the dancers primarily. Something unpleasant occurred, which was that while the dancers agreed with my vision to step it up and become better, more polished, and worthy of going up on main stage, everybody was on board for that. But Patty took a really regimented approach to it. They felt like it wasn't fun anymore. A large group of the core group came up to me and said, either Patty lightens up or we leave. And she didn't want to change, and she left. Most of the dance groups stayed with my group. Some of them went with her, and they became Merry Pranksters. We went on as Pipe and Bowl and Newcastle and proceeded to work on getting sharper and sharper, particularly in the Morris. which, by the way, Pipe and Bowl in Newcastle just celebrated their 50th anniversary. So I did what Richard Chase asked. I didn't let it die.
Now, this is just a strictly personal observation, and if I'm completely wrong, please tell me if I am. But the Morris dancers always seem to have a particular, I can't describe it as something other than a particular swagger, that when they're wearing their bells, they have their sticks, they're walking through fair. It's a swagger. Can you either explain or tell me if that's valid, or what makes the Morris dancers different from the other people you might see out at fair?
There was a thing about Pipe and Bowl, and this is really about the group. When we were first putting that together, I mentioned Patty Blanco and Richard Seville and Greg Dana and their contributions. Greg, by the way, is the guy who went on and formed the Bones Band. Yeah, that's Greg Dana. He lives in Japan now. He's a puppeteer, and he's actually a Japanese public treasure.
But back to Pipe and Bowl.
Pipe and Bowl, when we were putting it together, Farmer and I, well, actually, that's jumping ahead. Bob Glessner, one of the dancers that learned from Uncle Dick. We were working on putting the dance group and getting the dance group tight. Bob was a phenomenally good dancer. I'm a pretty damn good dancer. Bob was over the top. We got a place together on an old chicken ranch in Petaluma and started doing workshops up there and getting the guys to all come and practice for a couple of weeks. If you were going to take a vacation, you took it with the guys. Anyway, Farmer and I were living in this little farmhouse, and I got home from work. I was working at a sawmill in town, and Bob was a potter, master potter, and he was making his money throwing pots. Anyway, I got home from work, and he was out in the garden. Hey, Bob, it's Friday evening. Let's have a beer. Let's relax. He goes, well, I want to get this last row in here. And I said, you're turning into a farmer. And he looked at me and he goes, you're such a Bruno. Bruno stuck and Farmer stuck. If you go to any Pipe and Bowl and talk about Farmer, they know who you mean. So Bob became Farmer. I became Bruno. And in a matter of months, every Pipe and Bowl member became known as Bruno. And Bruno was a way of life, and it was an attitude. It was a swagger. Certainly. We do this hot shit dancing and we do it really well, and come and enjoy it. And I don't know, it just clicks. I will say that just like any group, especially something that's been going on for 50 years, it's got its high points and low points where it's got better dancers, or I might look at them and go, you guys are really clicking, looking good, guys. Or I'll look at them and I go, you guys need to practice a little more. You're getting sloppy. Getting into Pipe and Bowl was not that simple. It actually seemed to be a lot harder than it is. But Jason Adagian and Michael Parvin, they joined Pipe and Bowl by coming to me and saying, I want to be a Pipe and Bowl. What do I have to do? And it was funny because I was living in a house in Novato, and my roommate was K-Pat, and the house was on Bruno Street. So the house on Bruno Street, every Thursday night, there was a Pipe and Bowl rookie training going on. They had to bring a 6-pack of beer and wear tennis shoes and be prepared to have your ass worked off, because you don't do those dances without working really, really hard for a long time. People were talking about the heat, and it immediately brought to mind a Southern Fair where we came out with a frying pan, set it on main stage, broke 2 eggs into it, did our show, and held up the pan and showed the audience the cooked eggs, and then said, buy us a beer, and went to the ale stand. We got a ton of beer. So the swagger is there, and it's part of, the origin of those dances, the sword dances, the stick dances, and the handkerchief dances. Here's a funny story for you. One of the Brunos, Hal Tapkins, looks like ZZ Top. That Bruno, who's no longer with us, rest in peace, Hal. I was at home one day and the phone rang and it was Hal, and he says, turn on PBS right now. And I'm like, what? And he says, turn on PBS right now. And I go, okay, I turn on the TV, I turn on PBS, and here's Pipe and Bowl on stage at the fair dancing. And there's this professor who is narrating this video of the Renaissance Fair. And the dancers were doing a dance called the stork. They were doing the show present figure. Well, the guy is talking about this dance is about the bird, the stork, and it's hunting for its food in the wetlands and blah, 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 blah. And I started laughing out loud and made it a quest to track this guy down. Turned out his name was Hugh English, and he was a professor of emeritus in English literature at Berkeley. And he had done a video of the fairs and including pipe and bowl, and had done this description. So I finally managed to get his phone number, and I called him, and he called me back. And I said, Professor English, I'll introduce myself. I'm the squire and founder of Pipe and Bowl Morris, and that's the group that you shot at the fair. And when he was doing the narrative, he said, this ancient dance has been passed down for centuries. And I said, well, I wanted to help you out a little bit because you had a couple of things not quite right. While some of the dances we do are actually several centuries old, or up to 1,000 years old, this particular dance I wrote about 1.5 years ago. So thank you very much for your endorsement. But the stork is only about 1.5 years old. And by the way, that show present figure is not a bird hunting for its food in the swamp. It actually is all about impressing the women. That is what that figure is for, to show off. That's why the dancers step out and do a caper cadence, and they all do this show present. It's just like, look at how hot that is. You see that? So yeah, there's a swagger to it. There's no question about it. And some of the dances, the Flamborough sword dance, I mean, you have got to be in top-notch physical shape to do that dance. You can't possibly pull it off if you're not. Your tongue will be hanging out. You'll be falling on the floor. The Flowers of the North and Fish in the Mill Pond, both of the dances that I wrote, about half of Pipe and Bowl's repertoire is traditional, and the other half are dances that I choreographed. But those dances are incredibly vigorous. Going into a fair, they'd talk about fair workshops. We'd been meeting for 6 weeks before fair workshops started. And we'd meet at least once a week, usually twice a week, for 4 hours of dancing, solid, hard dancing to get to where you get. So when you put that much into it and you know how good it looks and everybody's clicking, then there's a swagger.
When you were practicing, who were your musicians, and were they the same as the ones you used out at the fair?
Absolutely. And Ricker always. Ricker came to everything. Brian Delarmy, another fiddler, he passed away some time ago. Rest in peace, Brian. He was a good dude and my best fishing buddy. Brian, when we were at Southern Fair, Brian worked for CBS and lived in Northridge, I think it was. We would get together in the park there, and he would come and play for us, and Ricker would come anyway. Usually I was Ricker's transportation, and I'd find him and bring him there. And when Sue Carney joined and started playing penny whistle for us, she'd show when she could. If we were in Northern California, she was always there. It was always our regular musicians, and it was always the metronome of Ricker in the background.
One of the highlights of any time I went to fair was watching the Bones Band sort of slink through.
Right?
What can you share with me about the Bones Band that I didn't know?
Well, Greg Dana, I don't know if that has been mentioned to you, but he's the founder of the Bones Band. I was not part of Bones Band, but Greg Dana originally left the group with Richard to do Mummers Plays, and they did John Barleycorn Must Die, Mummers Play. And then Greg came up with this idea to do the Dance Macabre. He ran across references to Dance Macabre, Old English literature, and said, oh, this would play. And, considering not that far removed from plague years. And so he came up with the whole idea. The costumes and things like that are straight out of the woodcuts and stuff of the Dance Macabre. And the instruments The xylophone sounded like bones and all of that. Greg, among other things, builds instruments, and he built all of those.
I'd like to once again shift gears and give you a series of hypothetical counterfactual questions. The first is, I would like you to give me a Morris dancer set that gives you joy.
Sure. The first dance is a dance out, which is done to the Morris call. And it's a traditional procession, walking, sort of swaggering onto the performance area. Then the first dance, because it really lights it up with a bang, is a stick dance called Constant Billy. That the lyrics, oh, me Billy, me constant Billy, when will I see my Billy again? When the fish flies o'er the mountain, that's when I'll see my Billy again. And there are wicked stick clashes with it. And funny story is, there used to be the Mendocino Brewing Company in Hopland had a brew pub up there. And Bob Thomas lived near there, and he got friendly with the owner and introduced the concept of us coming up and dancing for him. And he was going to do an Oktoberfest, and things all came together. And so for all we could drink and all we could eat, he left without a shirt, but he got a great show. And we came out for the first time we danced there, marching out in our Morris on with our bells and our handkerchiefs and all of this. And most of the audience were bikers. And they were pointing at us and laughing and howling. They're just like, ah! And we broke into Constant Billy. And by the end of that dance, they were going, it was testosterone over the top. And they got it. So I would open with Constant Billy. Then I would go to a handkerchief dance, and then Trunkles. Trunkles is a handkerchief dance that shows off individual footwork because it entails capering two corners and centers in separate. They caper to the center and face off, and then spin past each other and caper out, all with these incredible handkerchief movements. If your eye catches it, you'll find that when we land together in the center of the stage, we're both have our arms out like this, and our handkerchiefs are standing straight up. It's a classic. Constant Billy and Trunkles are both classics. In other words, they date back to at least 1500s and probably more like 1200s. And then after Constant and Trunkles, I would do Fish in the Mill Pond. That is another stick dance, and it's another wicked stick dance, but it also has a very complex hay figure that I invented. So it's one of my dances, one of my choreographs, Fish in the Mill Pond, and it has a figure called a cross hay, which basically makes it look like you put all the dancers into a mix master, and then they all of a sudden come out magically into lines and go back and get mixed up and come out this way. And how did they do that? It's like sleight of hand, only with our bodies. So I do Fish in the Mill Pond. Then I would do Pagans and Puritans. Pagans and Puritans is also a dance that I wrote. It's a 5-man Morris dance. There's an odd man, and almost always in Morris, it's a 2-man dance, a 1-man dance, a 2-man dance, a 4-man or a 6-man or an 8-man. So it's a maverick, and it's a 5-man dance. And it's called Pagans and Puritans. Oh, I've neglected to mention one thing, which is Fish in the Mill Pond, Pagans and Puritan, and all the dances that I wrote, I dreamed the key figures. The dances, I woke up and said, that's a dance, and sat down and wrote it out, at least the principal figure. And so in Pagans and Puritans, there are 5 dancers. Essentially, you do figures for 4, and the one person who's not included in the figure goes around the circle, but they go to the center of the circle and do whatever the fuck they want to do. They can go into the center and they can sit down and laugh at everybody who's dancing. They can grab their beer and go to the center and take a drink or two before they have to get up and dance back into the circle. Because the hey is for 5. The weave figure is for 5, H-E-Y. The point of pagans and Puritans is that we all have our points of view. We all have our own faith, but we are actually all really doing the same dance, and they're all valid, pagans and Puritans.
What's the music? Did you write the music for that dance, or what music?
Fish in the Mill Pond, I actually asked Jason to do this for me because I talked to him probably a month or so ago. I need a list of these. I no longer recall who wrote the tunes, but Pagans and Puritans, I'm pretty sure was written by Stacy Trevenant, and Fish in the Mill Pond, I believe, was written by Sue Carney. Then Flower of the North, and Flower of the North is another dance that I wrote, and the story behind it was that there was a group of the women from the Kelp camp that came to our in-yard show every single day. Big group of them, and they were in a knot up in the front, and they'd hoot and holler and buy us beer and cheer us on. And so Flower of the North was written for them. And again, it has a very complex hay figure in it. And that is 5. And for number 6, I'd close with the stork, because it's relatively relaxed and it shows us off the precision of the dancing and the fact that everybody's in exactly the same spot. Handkerchief wise, foot wise, where they are is tight, tight, tight. And in a typical set, those would be the main dances, and they'll almost always be at least one solo or dual dance. If it's a solo, it's Princess Royal, which shows the complexity of the dance movements and lets you focus on that because it's just one guy doing it. And then there's the Back-a-Pipes jig, which is essentially the same as a Scottish cross swords, but traditionally done with the long clay pipes. So if you touch one, you're going to break it.
I'm going to ask you again another counterfactual. If you lived in a world where there was not a Renaissance fair, how do you think your life would have played out?
I probably would have gone to Princeton and accepted the scholarship I was offered.
In what?
Science. And I probably would have been a scientist. But I got into the fair and got into the dance group, and Richard Chase said, "It's all yours and don't let it die." And I decided that that's what I wanted to do, and screw Princeton. My parents were not happy with me.
Did they ever reconcile to your choice of the fair?
Yes, my mom was okay with it from the get-go. She said, "Do what you love." My dad was like, "Are you nuts?"
What did he do?
What did my dad do?
Yeah, what did your dad do, and what did your dad see as your career path absent the fair?
University and science education. My dad worked for Republic Aviation. He was an aerospace engineer guy, and they went out of business in the early 60s. There was like a collapse of that industry back on the East Coast. We were on Long Island, and we all moved to California, and he became a tax assessor.
When you were kind enough to say yes to this interview, was your next thought, I got to be sure to mention so-and-so? So this is your opportunity to say, I haven't mentioned so-and-so, but I got to mention him or her or this dance.
Well, I just tip my hat to the original dancers. I mean, the people who started with Richard Chase and carried us over the hump into the fair. One gal who I'm a friend with on Facebook, Vicky Sauls, was part of the original group with Richard Chase. She lived in Claremont, and she is an artist, and she sculpted all of those characters. Ice Age movies. She sculpted the bull, Ferdinand the Bull. She sculpted the squirrel. Anyways, I mentioned her because she was one of the original dancers. The first wave of new blood, we needed new blood right after splitting with Richard Chase. There were some people who were sort of fading away and didn't want to put that much time into the dance and learn the Morris dancing. So that would include Leonard Melendez. Leonard was there during the Bruno days. Ron Collins, who is the man that I handed the group over to when I retired from it. I said, okay, it's your turn. Don't let it die. And he carried it for twice as long as I did. I went about 12 years. He went about 25. And now I gather that Jason is pretty much in charge, which would have been the next person I'd pick too. So they got it wired. I think they'll be doing this 50 years after I'm dead. Other people or other things. Well, posthumously to Dave Ricker. I mean, if it were not for Dave, I don't think we'd have gotten halfway to where we got. Huge, huge influence on me and on the dance group. And I would set a beat and he would set that beat and he'd stay on that beat and I'd better stay on that beat. We had developed over the years a nonverbal communication. I could walk up, the set would form, and I'd sit there and I'd tap my heel and Rick'd be on it, and that was it. Then it would take off. And God rest his soul, Richard Chase, an amazing man. And if you want a fun read sometime, look up the Jack Tales or the Grandfather Tales. I think that's probably about it.
Well, I think I've sort of run out of words. So let me hit the stop record button. Did your wife want to come in and mention some of her friends who from Fair that expanded her horizons?
He's walking over here mumbling.
Okay, you want names, huh? I gotta name names. Laura Spanier is one of them. Thank you, Bree Hurley. And Laura Spanier. I mentioned that I came out of a very, very conservative background. And when Doug and I got back together, and I showed up with a perm and makeup and pretty much the antithesis, is that the word, of everything that was your normal fair woman. And they picked me up and dusted me off, put me into a space where I could survive in my new reality. I knew I would with Doug. Doug and I were supposed to be together. We were soulmates. We are soulmates. But they showed me how to live in this new world that I had found, that I had landed in.
Well, I think that is a wonderful way to illustrate how the fair has influenced people and a wonderful way to stop recording. So thank you very much. And I will once again find the stop recording button. Oh, there it is. Well, that's my January 2024 interview with Douglas Michael Berger, with additional comments by Sally Burdenberger. If you have questions for either of these two, you may forward them to me at djng@earthlink.net. Questions or comments about the podcast itself can also be directed to me at djng@earthlink.net. Finally, if you or someone you know would like to be a guest on Fair Folk at Work, please contact me at djng@earthlink.net. That's it for this time. Thanks for listening. Bye-bye.